There's this amazing tool that Microsoft provides called SharePoint. And a lot of companies start to embrace SharePoint and start to try and get people to use it. But I guess one of the big challenges is actually getting people on board with it. So the first thing I want to talk about this morning is just a little bit about what is SharePoint. So I noticed a few of you, when Kylie was asking, were a little bit new to SharePoint. So a couple of things. First thing, SharePoint is, well, Microsoft builds it as a collaboration platform. That's the terminology that they use. But at its most basic, SharePoint is just a tool for developing a website. Now, it is a specific type of website. I have seen people use SharePoint for public websites, but I think there's better tools out there for public websites if you're developing a website for the rest of the world to look at. What SharePoint really lends itself is a controlled environment where you have access to specific people, but the idea of having shared content, a place where your team or your department or your region can come together and access all the content that they need for their group. But the other great thing about SharePoint is that it is secure. And so you can then lock it down so that only certain people can see the content, but more importantly, only certain people can change the content. The other great thing about SharePoint is that obviously it's used through your browser, through Internet Explorer or through Chrome or Firefox, whatever browser you use, but you can also use it through your web devices, through your mobile devices as well. So there is a SharePoint app for Android and for iOS that you can actually download. Now, some basic SharePoint terminology. If you've been using SharePoint for a while, you'll know some of this stuff. But look, the first thing, a SharePoint site, okay, is built off this idea of a bit of a tree structure. You have a top-level site, you have sub-sites coming off that. So, for example, the top-level site could be for the company. Those orange sites could be for my departments. And so there might be a site for IT, and there might be a site for HR, there might be a site for finance. But then off the finance site, you might have some sub-sites down there. So payroll might have their own site, and accounts might have their own site. But collectively, they make up this idea of a site collection. Now, each site, yes, generally around a specific purpose. So you have a site for a particular team or for a region or for a department, but you can also start to create other sites. So for example, you can create project sites. I can have a site around a specific project where there's all the tasks and documentation they need in one place. Now, a little bit more SharePoint terminology. Every SharePoint site's made up of several building blocks. So the first of these is your pages. So every site has a home page, and one of the great things about SharePoint is that you start with a home page. You can have as many of these web pages as you want, but developing web pages in SharePoint, you don't need any web design experience. Okay? You don't need any coding experience or programming experience in order to be able to work with web pages in SharePoint. If you know how to work with Word documents, you already know a lot about SharePoint. You have your lists. So you have lists that store information. So that's, for example, a contacts list or a task list or a calendar. You've also got your libraries, and libraries store your files. So you can have document libraries, picture libraries. Now what I'm going to quickly do, this is our SharePoint demo site. If anyone has done any of our SharePoint courses here, you've probably seen this before. This is a fictitious travel agency that we use in a lot of our training materials called Sojourn Travel. But this is part of the SharePoint site that we actually use for our training courses. So I wanted to quickly talk about what we actually see on a SharePoint site. So this site here is for a company called Sojourn Travel. What we're looking at here is the home page. Now, as I mentioned, in terms of editing the home page, you don't need any web design experience in order to develop a page like this. But you can see on the home page, we've got some pictures, we've got some links to some documents, we've got some information there on our vendors. What you'll also find on this site is that we have a few other pages. For example, there's a page which goes through our office locations. Once that decides to load. One of the things you're going to find about SharePoint, we're using Office 365 at the moment here. Now, one of the things about SharePoint using Office 365, and you mentioned about transitioning from 2010 to 2016 or to SharePoint under Office 365, it's in a bit of transition phase at the moment. So at various points when you're using SharePoint, you get thrown between the classic experience and the modern experience. So you may have noticed actually just going between the two there, that when I was on the home page, it all looked a little bit different. Okay, the navigation looked a little bit different top and down. The left-hand side looked a little bit different. But as soon as I went into that office locations page, it all changed a bit. Yeah, okay, you're going to find in this transition phase at the moment, that's going to be one of the big challenges for your people, is some things are going to have to be done through the modern experience, which is what we were looking at in the previous page. Some things are going to be done through the classic experience. And this is something we talk about in our courses, is working between the two experiences at the moment. Until Microsoft goes fully modern experience, you're just going to have to work between the two. Look, there's another page. And so you can see there's some information there on the Brisbane office and the Melbourne office and some contact information. Now, what's actually great is that that is actually Google Maps there. You'll see that I can zoom in and zoom out on that map. This is something we talk about in our courses, how to embed code in your pages. That's some pages. We've got a few other things on this side. There's a document library there. All right, you want to store documents, and this is where people will go to collaborate on their documents. And you can upload the documents. You can also control who can change the documents. You can also enable versioning control in here so that if you want to roll a document back to how it looked 2 weeks ago, you can do that. You can have other libraries in there. There's a photo library in there as well to store some travel photos. We've got a few lists in here as well. So there is a vendor list. So there you go. So there's some information on the vendors. Or if I go back to the list, there is a calendar. Again, you'll notice it just spat us back into that classic experience. What other lists have we got there? Oh, there's a discussion board there. Okay, and you can see there's a discussion board. Now the great thing about these SharePoint sites is that they're scalable. So, you know, at the moment we've got 2 or 3 document libraries, but if you want more document libraries, you just create more document libraries. You want a second calendar, you create a second calendar. And so all of these elements you can expand on any site and start to add them into any site. All right. Now, coming back over to here. Now, companies spend a lot of money, a lot of time, a lot of effort, okay, putting these SharePoint sites together. But the problem is, okay, and I've seen this time and time again, people will create these SharePoint sites and then a couple of months in, no one's actually using it. And then it doesn't get updated, and then of course when it doesn't get updated, then people don't go there, they find other places to get the information they want. Look, SharePoint sites are really driven by people contributing and collaborating. All right? And getting people together to work on a SharePoint site is the key to making it work. So the biggest challenge with implementing SharePoint sites? Getting people to use it. So why is that a challenge? Well, look, a few things, okay? Why aren't you using the SharePoint site? Well, that could be for quite a few reasons. What's SharePoint? Okay, I mean, that comes down to communicating to your staff what SharePoint is, how they access it, why they should be using it. I have no idea how to use it. Well, that might be lack of technical skills. That might be that they haven't received any training or they haven't got access to any ongoing support. I have no idea what it can do. You're going to have to sell SharePoint a little bit. Let people know what the capabilities are, all right, the potential of SharePoint. No one told me I had to use it. Well, yeah, again, that comes down to a little understanding of the benefits of SharePoint. I don't see any reason to use it. The site doesn't do what I need it to do. Well, that might come down to staff not being actively engaged with the site, not being engaged in the design and the implementation. All right, so to that end, AIIM did a survey. I think this was a couple of years ago now. So AIIM, they're a non-profit organisation. They provide education, market research, certification for information professionals. But they surveyed 274 of their members, and they found that SharePoint use has increased incrementally, but 58% said SharePoint remains a challenge. 40% said their SharePoint implementations aren't successful. Now what's interesting is about that 40, based on breaking down that 40%, 67% of those people blamed that on inadequate user training. 66% said it's difficult to use, which to me actually sort of leads back into that first one. And 64 report that lack of support from senior management is the reason their deployments have failed. That's a significant number of people saying that they've put all that time and effort and money into SharePoint and it hasn't actually work for them. Okay, so what I'm suggesting here is 5 ways that we can drive successful SharePoint adoption. The first way is you get everyone involved. And I do mean everyone in the organization, because SharePoint's key is that collaboration. So the first thing you want to do is talk about SharePoint. Let people know about the SharePoint site. Let them know what it can do for them. Let them know how it can support their business processes, how the site can make their job easier and faster. Let them know that that site is out there and that's where they need to go to get that information. And to a certain extent, you don't want to spoon feed it to them. You want to point them in the direction of the SharePoint site. Look, it's on the SharePoint site. Go and do a search. SharePoint has very powerful searching capabilities built in. And so if they're looking for that new user form that they need to complete, well, get them to go onto the SharePoint site. Look, all you got to do is search for new user form. There you go, it pops up. You are going to have to help people initially, okay, to get used to the fact that, okay, it's on the SharePoint site. That's where you're going to need to go to find that. Encourage your team to contribute to the development of the site. As I said, SharePoint works best when it's not just one person's responsibility, it becomes everyone's responsibility. I mean, here at Odyssey Training, we use SharePoint for our intranet, and it becomes everyone's responsibility to maintain that content. And so that becomes really useful, because if someone notices that a particular document is out of date, well, they have the ability to jump in there and fix it up and update it. Management actively using your site could be a big win. You saw that in that previous slide where we're looking at the statistics, that management involvement is actually really key. So look, some ways that you can get management involved, possibly obviously getting them to start to be responsible for the content on the site, getting them for being responsible for maintaining the content on the site. And I'm not giving them sole responsibility, I'm getting them involved. But again, you're going to have these people, especially management, who might be reluctant to get too involved with SharePoint. Give them small ways. For example, there might be a discussion board you put on your site. You saw that on our demo site. New tour ideas. Well, that's a great way then for the staff to be able to put stuff in there, but also then for management to get involved and be able to go in there and say, look, actually this is good. I'm going to put some comments in here as well. I mean, the whole point of a discussion board is people discussing stuff, so getting people to use it is actually really good. It might even be something like getting questions from staff and then having management answer those questions and having them on the front page of your site. You want to make sure this stuff gets updated frequently. SharePoint sites fail when they don't get updated. But yeah, getting management to use your site can be a big win. Second thing, feeding your SharePoint champions. You're going to have these people within your organization who just grab SharePoint and run with it. Now, those are the people you want to identify. So encourage enthusiasm. Give people, if you've got your SharePoint people, give them the ability to jump in and start playing around with the site. You'll be amazed what people can make SharePoint do. One of the great things about SharePoint, it is easy to pick up, okay, and start with, but it is very, very powerful and very flexible. I'm always amazed what people can make SharePoint do once they start to understand all the little building blocks. Look, if someone has taken the time to address and implement a solution to a real-world problem in SharePoint, give them some credit. All right? You want to make sure that those SharePoint champions actually feel valued. Let others know about these small wins. All right. So your SharePoint champions are going to be key to you being able to encourage everyone else. The other thing you can do, encourage your champions to try out new things. One of the best things you can do when you're developing SharePoint is to actually set up a testing and training environment alongside your intranet. All right? And you give your SharePoint champions the ability to jump in there and try things out. Let them have a bit of a play around in there before they start trying to implement them on the live site. At least then they've got somewhere where they can go and they know that if they break something, it's not too dramatic or too drastic, because it is just the testing and training environment. Now, a little bit more SharePoint terminology. Almost everything that you can do in SharePoint is controlled by what level of permission you have. Now, there's 3 basic levels of permissions. Again, if you've done any of our SharePoint courses, you would have seen this. So you have your site visitors. So if someone's a visitor for a site, they can't change anything. Now, that makes sense, because if I'm in IT and I go onto one of the finance sites, well, there's no reason why I need to change the content on that finance site. So for that finance site, I'd be a visitor. The level up from a visitor is your members. Your members are your content managers. So these are the people who can go into the document libraries and add, modify, and delete the documents. And they can go into those contact lists and add, modify, and delete the contacts. And so you're going to have, you might find that for a particular site, everyone in the organisation gets to be a visitor, but only specific people get to be members. Now the level up from that is your owners. The owners are the people who are responsible for the site. They can do everything the members and the visitors can do, but they can also do a lot more. For example, if your site has 3 document libraries and someone identifies that they need a 4th, well, your owner can jump in and create that document library for them. If you've got a contacts list where you've got your name and your address and your email address, but you want a few extra columns in there, you want to customize it a little bit, well, your owners can do that. Your owners ultimately are also responsible for deciding who gets to be an owner, who gets to be a member, who gets to be a visitor, and that's modifying your permissions. So those owners are the key. You need to know, let the people, the members and the visitors know who your owners are, who are the go-to people for a particular site. So each site should have at least one owner who is ultimately responsible for the management of the site. Now I say at least one owner, you generally want 2 or 3, so that it's not one person's responsibility, it's several people's responsibility. But what's really important is your visitors and your members need to know who the owners of the site are. And so each site, remember when we were looking at that, the little tree structure there where we had lots of little sites? Each site has their own owner. So for example, someone in finance will be the owner of the finance site, someone in IT will be the owner of the IT site, someone in HR will be the owner of the HR site. But you need to let the people using the site know who that go-to person is. So what I tend to do on pretty much every site I create is somewhere on that home page, I will have the name and the contact details of the site owners so people know exactly who that go-to person is. Number 4, try and encourage site traffic. I've seen a lot of SharePoint sites that are very text heavy. Text, 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 text. Add some colour in, add some pictures in, add some charts in. It's amazing what that does to just make it more interesting and visually lift the site. Make SharePoint the source for critical information so that staff are forced to use it. Okay? Put your policies are up there. Okay? You want to access any of the policies, you've got to go to the SharePoint site. All your forms go on the SharePoint site. You want to access any of the forms, they go on the SharePoint site. If you've got important stuff up there that people have to use and have to access, they're going to go to the SharePoint site and they're going to find all the other stuff on there as well. Making that home page interesting is also very useful. Okay, so adding items of interest to the front page of your site. It might even be stuff like, news items and weather reports and, staff photos. That home page is really, I guess, the doorway into all the other content. Now the last one, step 5. Don't assume that staff will pick up SharePoint by themselves. Now, to some extent that isn't true. Some people will be able to just jump in and start playing around with SharePoint and trying it out, but most will benefit from having some sort of training. Okay, especially since with SharePoint, I know a lot of people, your day-to-day job gets in the way of you being able to get in there and play around with it. So having a dedicated half day, 1 day, 2 days to sit there and just play around with SharePoint is actually really beneficial, and also to be able to ask questions. Look, this is especially important for users to be involved in adding and modifying the site content. So that's your members and your owners. Your site owners should ideally be trained so that they understand the responsibility they have and what a site owner is required to do. Yes, your owners are going to need to be able to support your visitors and your members. And so your owners should have a good understanding of all the stuff the SharePoint site can do, so that when the members come to them and the visitors come to them, can SharePoint do this? Yes, it can do that. And yes, I can actually make those changes so that SharePoint can do that for you. If you get people embracing your SharePoint site, I can guarantee you're going to achieve these 2 aims. So your ultimate aim with having a SharePoint site is really what I see as 2 things. Number 1, to have a SharePoint site that are actively engaged with, and that word actively is really important. But to have a tool that adds value to your business. And if you can get people involved in embracing that SharePoint site, I can guarantee you will achieve those 2. Now, I mentioned previously about training your users. Obviously, Odyssey Training, okay, we provide SharePoint training courses. So a couple of the courses that we actually provide, so we have a course specifically for SharePoint for Office 365, and this is for your site owners. Now, this is a 2-day course. Okay, it's developed specifically for those site owners who are going to take responsibility for their site. Okay, but it's about being able to create sites and create sub-sites, create pages, edit those pages, maintain your document libraries, customize your document libraries, add in versioning, permissions, controlling who has access to the site, modifying and customizing the navigation, and the concept of workflows, automation through SharePoint. So all of our locations, Brisbane, Sydney, Melbourne, we have public courses scheduled throughout the year, generally one a month. And so that's, as I said, a 2-day course, but they use our dedicated SharePoint training environment. Now, we do have a couple of other courses. So if anyone is using an older version of SharePoint, we do have a course specifically for SharePoint 2013. Once upon a time, SharePoint 2013 and SharePoint as part of Office 365 were very similar. Especially over the last 12 months, though, that gulf is becoming wider and wider. So we have now split these into 2 courses. You will find a lot of the content is the same. And if you are using an older version of SharePoint at the moment, when you do eventually move over to Office 365, or if you move over to Office 365, you will find that a lot of the content is the same. But specifically for anyone using an older version of SharePoint, we do have a course there for them. We also have a Site Owner Advanced course, which is another 2-day course. And this follows on from our 2-day Site Owner course. And so we talk in there about some of the things that a power user is going to use. We talk about creating custom forms. We about creating custom workflows. So that's talking about automation, or automating business processes through SharePoint. So we have that 2-day course as well. The other thing with any of our courses is that we can run these as in-house training. And so these can either be on-site or here at Odyssey offices. But all of these courses can be customized. And so if you don't have 2 days, we can organize 1 day of training, okay, if you want to do a 1-day site owner course. We can also organize training for your site members and your site visitors as well. Look, thank you for listening. So